Okay, I think we're going to try to get going. I hope everybody had a chance to get some lunch. I'm sorry about the elevators. I think one of them broke down last night, and it's been hard to get people up and down. So thanks for your patience. I'd like to welcome you to the Wilson Center. My name's Dave Rajewski. I run the Science and Technology Innovation Project. And about a year ago, we started a little sort of internal venture project. It started with sort of an interesting thought exercise. We asked the question, what about if we begin to look at the large amount of research that's been done on complex dynamic systems? It's been done at universities, Santa Fe Institute. What happens if we took that and internalized it? How would it change our business model? How would it change the way we think, the way we analyze? We were also very interested in how would it change how we communicate. How do we communicate really complex ideas to the public, to the policy world? This is our job as a think tank or as a policy research institute, and it's the same problem in a lot of universities. So one of the things we've been trying to do is find people that have kind of work in that interstitial space. There's not a lot of them, but we brought in an economist a few months ago, David Collender, who has done a lot of work on applying sort of complexity theory to economics. And I think after he came, Hilton wrote me an email and said, "This is interesting. I'd love to come and give you a talk." And Hilton's done, I think, some phenomenal work in thinking through how one would take this complexity frame and apply it to international relations, which, of course, is a sweet spot of the Wilson Center and an awful lot of think tanks in Washington, D.C., as well as agencies like the State Department, AID. So Hilton is a professor at the George Mason University School of Public Policy, also at King's College. You've got a bio, which goes through a lot of his background. And basically the way we've set this up is he's going to talk for 20, 30 minutes, no slides, abandoned PowerPoint. And then we'll have a conversation for another half an hour or so. I would say that this is kind of a landmark event for us because there's free food and potentially free books. So as you saw the pile out there, MIT Press was incredibly gracious, I think, and they sent 15 of Hilton's books down. And if you put a business card in the little fishbowl out there, we're going to raffle these off at the end. So stick around, and I think you can stay for a little while if you want. Book signings, further conversation, and if you've come, you're on our list now. You're on our complexity list. So we're working on a new paper on communicating complexity that will roll out probably in a few months, and we're going to be looking to do more book launches and events like this. So hopefully we'll see you in the future at future events, and I'll turn it over to Hilton.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. So I'm going to be contrarian in two ways. I'm not going to use PowerPoint, and I'm going to talk about probably the most un-Wilsonian figure in American foreign policy in recent times, and that's Henry Kissinger. And the reason I've chosen Henry Kissinger to be the focus of my comments is that he recently published a book with Penguin that is on the same topic, more or less, as of my book. And his book is called World Order, and it covers a lot of the same concerns. A lot of the same motivations are there. However, his book uses a very different mental framework, and it's constructed around very traditional ideas that have dominated policymaking, not only in foreign policy but also in economics. And what is so what's interesting about this book, from my perspective, is that Kissinger, as many of you know, is rather disdainful of social science. And has made it clear throughout his career that he doesn't see science as particularly relevant to the kind of things that statespeople, or statesmen, he uses the word statesman, so I'll use it, do. And so, ironically, what I'm going to say is that although he is outspoken in his disregard of social science, and he's a renegade from science itself, he is also its victim. And why do I say this? Because in his book, he uses two concepts that are very prevalent in social science thinking that derive from a thermodynamic Newtonian view of the world. And it's exactly that view of the world that I'm going to address in the later part of my comments. So let me just tell you a little bit about Kissinger's new book. And another reason I chose this is that the ideas in this book are probably very familiar to this audience. There's nothing very, very new in the new book, and nothing that would not surprise you if you follow the way Kissinger has been thinking about the conduct of international relations throughout his career. So his book of global order rests on two foundational ideas. One is homogeneity of agent perspectives, and the other is equilibrium of outcomes. So he believes that stable systems, and stability is his major concern, stability and legitimacy and the relationship between the two, require both of these foundations. And he then talks about post-World War II American foreign policy as an effort to create a community of nations that would be committed to upholding a consensus, a particularly American consensus, which we can define as international liberalism. And all of you, I think, would know what that would include: a cooperative order of states that observe common rules, that have common norms, that embrace liberal economic systems, that would forswear territorial conquest, and that would respect national sovereignty and adopt democratic systems of governance. Now, his concern is that the consensus is weakening, and this is going to be deeply problematic for the future stability of the world order. So the world order constructed around these concepts is actually not only fragile, but it is being challenged by emerging powers. And these emerging powers were not originally party to the rules, and they made it clear that as they become more prevalent on the world stage, that they would seek to change the rules. And so the book is about the different mindsets or worldviews of these powers that are emerging, that are likely to have a very large influence on the larger topic of world order. And the concern is that there's no shared understanding of what the system is, and therefore we are going into a period of great uncertainty. So what passes for order in our time, Kissinger tells us, was something that was conceived in Europe nearly 4 centuries ago at a peace conference in the German region of Westphalia. And of course, many of you will be familiar with this. And so I'm going to do several things in my talk. I'm going to describe the balance of power as a system for stability, as Kissinger explains it in his book. Then I'm going to give you an alternative view of how European development occurred, coming from my book. And then I'm going to talk about the differences in the ways that we have constructed our arguments, and then from there we segue into discussing complexity. So for Kissinger, the Westphalian accomplishment is based primarily on the homogeneity of 200 European aristocrats who met in Westphalia, and having had a common experience of unlimited warfare, they decided that they needed to manage conflict, and they needed to come up with an agreement that would preserve the system and their role in the system. And so they all came from a very common background. And so this is where the word homogeneity comes in. And in fact, because they had a homogeneous viewpoint, they were able to construct rules or agree on rules that then became the guiding rules for European stability. And he then makes the statement that the 200 years of European expansionism that followed were made possible because of this agreement. And I will argue that this is not the case at all. So his view is that because of the equilibrium that was established on the basis of the balance of power concept that was articulated at Westphalia and memorialized at Westphalia, there was a period, especially the 18th century, of equilibrium and the end of ruinous warfare. So my argument is going to be one that to understand the European state system as a system, we have to think of it as a millennium, as a much longer system, in which the 18th century is but a peaceful interlude, or relatively peaceful interlude, and what is otherwise a 1,000-year, almost a continuous period of continuous warfare. And the second statement in which I'll disagree with is that it was not equilibrium that prevented ruinous war that gave Europe its special dynamics, which I will describe in a few minutes. It was actually preparation for perpetual war without limits that gave Europe an advantage over other world regions. So one of the criticisms that I will make of Kissinger's way of thinking, which is very different from how a complexity approach would frame these issues, is one, he attempts to grasp processes that occur at timescales that are either much faster than the resolution of his thinking, or he's talking about the formation of a European state system that occurs at a time scale that is much longer than the duration of those observations. So in both cases, he has a very fundamental problem that we encounter in complex systems, was a problem that he doesn't resolve the scale effects of different processes at different time scales that are interdependent. So it's a very complex issue, and scientists have learned increasingly how to talk about systems that do have these characteristics, and I would argue that the system of international relations has those scale effect type issues. So let me proceed to the question of, was equilibrium really the source of the old world stability? And I will suggest to the contrary, that what would really enable the European state system to attain extraordinary capabilities was its resilience. And why is resilience a much more important concept here than equilibrium? Because European history is a history of major perturbations. There are many, and these perturbations are what add scope and capacity to the European system. So the question for me as that I look at from a complexity point of view is, what is the source of this resilience? And I try to describe this resilience as residing in the network structure of European power, the distributed character of power, and this what we increasingly call scale-free nature of the European network of authority. And because of the scale-free structure, which I'll describe in a few minutes, and it's a term, unfortunately, we need to put in the conversation, Europe was better able to adapt to a changing environment, and was able to survive what I would call, or what scientists frequently call, equilibriums that are punctuated. And in fact, there is a small group of political scientists that are increasingly talking about European history in terms of these punctuated equilibriums. So the problem with the European system from an outsider point of view is that it's because of the distributed nature of authority, it would seem it is very difficult to supervise, and therefore was prone to generate large disruptive events. But because no system of centralized control existed, there was none to destroy. So that these events did not have system impacts that they might have had there been a central node in the system that if it was eliminated, then the system would disintegrate into a random network. So this is not a random network in Europe, it's a small world network. And its principal characteristic is that there are a number of families that are interrelated, aristocratic families, noble families, and they're all more or less equal to each other, and they are the principal nodes in the system. So in order to destroy the system, and Napoleon understood this and in fact tried to do this, he understood that you had to destroy all of the nodes, otherwise the system would reconnect itself. And this is a fundamental characteristic of scale-free systems, is that even if several nodes are removed, the system reconnects and it continues and it survives. And this is the source, I would say, of the resilience of the European system. This network structure has internal dynamics of its own. And these internal dynamics are not actually controllable. And this is the other major distinction I want to draw between my way of viewing this and Kissinger's. The dynamics in Kissinger's argument are all top-down. They're all vertical. And I'm going to argue that there are significant degrees of freedom in the middle of the system that allow for interactions to occur that, in fact, are never mentioned in his book, including the economy, including demographics. I'm looking at Jack Goldstone, who's written extensively about that. These dynamics will cause changes to occur in the properties of the system. And the most important one of these, the most important thing that Kissinger misses from using his perspective is that the European institutions of warfare exhibited continuous autonomy from its constituents. And what do I mean by this? Well, what I mean is that the expansion of warfare in Europe eventually put violence into the hands of the entire population, and that the spread of and the increasing professionalization of armies was itself a form of punctuated equilibrium, and it led to a continuous tactical and kinetic innovations in military hardware that drew ever larger subsets of the population into warfare, and eventually you get mass mobilizations that began under Louis XIV in France, and eventually was to culminate in two world wars, in which the skills of social organization and the technological skills that had become pervasive in the society due to the mass mobilizations, that these eventually emboldened the European masses to say, if we could conduct war, if we can do all of this warfare, we could also maybe self-govern ourselves. And this is an irony, by the way, that has been observed by many historians and thinkers. The irony being that the state system that was built to defend the society of orders ensured the destruction of that society. That the monarchies of Europe forced to pursue ends that were incompatible with the society of orders. I think you would see very clearly that if you start to look at the European system from that point of view, you have a fundamentally different set of values that become prominent than those that Kissinger emphasizes. My argument, and then finally, with regard to this particular issue, is that the inclusive fitness that was demanded for the conduct of warfare eventually led to an evolutionary shift in how the European state would be managed. So his emphasis on homogeneity of outlook, in my opinion, mistakes what is really a source of stagnation for the wellspring of European dynamism, and it was diversity, not equilibrium, that was a source of relentless novelty and capability that empires under one faith and one leader would not possess. And I'm going to look at China as a contrast here. China, unlike the European system, China, during the 2 millenniums of its history that we have records of, experienced cycles of decay and renewal, and did not have this scale-free characteristic that would provide the resilience that the European system had. So China's network of social authority and state construction is essentially a hub-and-spoke network. It was brilliantly constructed, and it had an underlying vulnerability, which was that it is very sensitive to the emergence of a secondary or a subsidiary node that might not be amenable to central control. So Chinese thinking understood this very clearly historically, and so any technology that might emerge in China that might damage the ability of the central hub to control social order would be repressed, and this is exactly what happens. And Chinese emperors astutely legislated against diffusions of those technologies that might lead to social transformation, controlling the flow of innovation to be sure that disruptive innovations like the printing press, like cannon, like artillery, like the kind of ships that China developed in the 15th and 16th century for intercontinental trade, that these things, instead of being cultivated, were actually repressed, and very effectively repressed. And a central part of that is the emperor's monopoly over coal, iron, smelting, and metallurgy. So, of course, many of you know that the Chinese developed gunpowder very early on, long before the West did. But if you don't have artillery, and if you don't have the ability to conduct, to create weapons that use gunpowder, gunpowder itself is just a decoration, and that's in fact part of the the Chinese story. The invention of movable type print, also, which occurred in China earlier, was repressed for the very reasons that Europeans tried to repress it. They saw that it could easily lead to a competition in a war of ideas that couldn't be controlled from the central palace. But in Europe, it was impossible to repress the printing press. Every country wanted to do so, but it was impossible because you had distributed authority. And this, of course, resulted in the European Reformation, whereas in China, the movable type wasn't introduced until the missionaries got there in the 19th century. Now, another aspect of China that I'm sure you're all very familiar with is that its emperor could aspire to perpetual harmony. It was a theme of Chinese social organization, whereas Europeans could do no better than manage perpetual violence, but certainly nobody would think of perpetual harmony as a goal of statecraft in Europe. So this answers a question that Kissinger doesn't ask, but many of you may be aware that one of the most important questions that are asked in Chinese history is why rapid and intensive technological change, the kind that transformed Europe, was so rare in China's history. And the answer here is that the Chinese authorities were fearful of anything that would create a challenge to the central node's ability to organize the society. And so the kind of phase transitions or avalanches of coevolutionary change that ring in the new and ring out the old, the kind of things that we see as characteristic in Europe, these kind of waves of system transforming innovations did not occur in China. Now, I'll say one thing about this to relate it to the 21st century, which is that, of course, the West's aristocratic dynasties and those of Imperial China are gone, but the differences between the network structure of the two societies remain, and it, in my judgment, may prove to be one of the critical issues that shape the future of global conflict. As the two systems that once held regional dominance compete for global domination, the Chinese will do this by trying to contain the social effects of new technologies, and the Americans will seek to unleash avalanches of novelty, revel in the transformation, their transformative effects, and the outcome will be determined by the American reverence of constant change and the Chinese aversion to it. So the systems, the fundamental characteristics, the network structures, and the internal dynamics that are derived from these structures are still very much in play. Now let me go back to Kissinger and talk about what happens when the U.S. comes into the picture. So the U.S. comes into the picture as the 1,000-year cycle of dynastic violence in Europe is reaching a point of no return. After World War II, the price of avoiding mutual self-destruction was to acquiesce to U.S. values and to allow the U.S. to take over the management of the global system. Europeans did this not because its leaders were essentially in agreement. They thought Wilsonian ideals were incredibly inflammatory. They were opposed to it, but there was no way to maintain Europe without America at this point. So they increasingly accepted the vision of world order that the U.S. brought with it. So in a sense, the U.S. is like a big stick, to paraphrase someone that Kissinger admires, and I also admire. It's a stick that hits the bowl of the European equilibrium, but it's such a blow that the old equilibrium is never reestablished again. So what does Kissinger draw from this? He draws the notion, and he's very didactic about this in his book, that Americans must learn to turn down their predilection for projecting Wilsonian idealism into the world and accept something that's more inclusive as a basis for world order. And I guess what he's suggesting is that would be a Westphalian value system. But I want to draw 2 points, and by the way, these are 2 points that he also makes, which is that the U.S. global engagement occurred only once the U.S. could be the dictator of the rules. In other words, the U.S. never wanted to play by the aristocratic rules of Europe, and it wasn't until it became the central node in the system that it was willing to be engaged internationalist. Now, actually, this is the same. Reflects I guess you would say, an irony or paradox with regard to the fact that today the U.S. wants other emerging powers to accept its rules, whereas it was unwilling to accept the rules of the world order that it had entered into. So Kissinger views this as he ultimately comes to the conclusion and that the only way that world order can be sustained is through a very, very strong resurgence of American leadership. And what I'm going to suggest is that the way the world system has evolved, and even the way that he describes it evolving, would make that very, very difficult. So before talking about, I'm not that interested in today's talk in the practicalities of his ideas. I'm much more interested in how we can learn to think about the dynamics of social change and stability by developing an analytical framework which is sufficiently broad that the full range of global interactions can come into focus. So my argument is that Kissinger is only looking at a very narrow part of the system, which is this top-down part of the system, and he's focused as the only dynamic actors in the system as being these so-called statesmen at the top of the system who are managing or supervising. Whereas I'm leading to the point that the system itself has internal dynamics that must be understood in there, and we need an analytical framework that enables us to do this. So how does he create his argument? Most of the 300 pages that follow are country studies, case studies. And the basic narrative is a pathway dependence narrative. And the core of the argument is that we can expect emerging actors to exhibit individual, group, or organizational behaviors driven by conflicting incentives that stem from their deeply rooted variations in what they've learned from their own local struggles, their ancient local struggles, and they have strong rules that they've obtained from knowledge one, and now they're going to try to project these rules globally. And the problem will be, of course, according to Kissinger, is that they won't be able to do so, and we'll have a system that instead of having a managed or constrained use of violence, every new player will seek to test the limits of the system. And of course, this is a much more challenging and threatening and uncertain environment, and this is the environment that has led him to write this book. The same concerns that I have. But I have problems with the way he constructs the argument, because it's not enough to show that different historical pathways result in different perspectives. We all know this. But we cannot, with any certainty, chart a nation's future behavior by selecting particular variables that were conspicuous in the past. We have no way of knowing what probability they will have of resurging. So, he gets into a discussion of Islam, which, by the way, is the most innovative part of his book, which reveals a certain new thinking that might be, I would recommend, if you want to understand his responses to issues such as the proliferation of weapons in the Middle East. Go to that part of the book. But once again, I'm looking at the analytical framework that he uses and the key insights that derive from understanding the intrinsic fitness of the internal structures of great nations, to me, is an insufficient way to understand the dynamics of global change. If we've learned nothing else from the study of complex systems, it is that the relationship between and among actors poses the main difficulty in solving coordination failures. And so it's not the intrinsic qualities of nations, it's the interactions among nations that need to be understood. And we need policy tools to understand how behaviors and beliefs of agents emerge from their interactions and how the agent interactions give rise to the collective behavior of the system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how one might discover the rules of what I call a tangled world. Kissinger's belief is the only way we can get away from this stock pattern of global conflict that's emerging is a regional order led by the U.S. of countries that he says, in quote, are able to take a global view. But as I'm going to suggest, the global view he suggests is a top-down view, and it's a very inadequate view, considering that the dynamics of global change are very unlikely to be top-down. They're most likely to be horizontal, and the most dynamic part of the world today is the middle regions that he ignores or that he thinks cannot play a directional role in establishing the new rules of the game, so to speak, or of global order. So my argument is that as links among nations and among subgroups within nations increase, and the subgroup part of that statement is very important, increase at an escalating rate, complexity, not equilibrium, has become the central conundrum of world order. The web of interactions has become so tangled that it restricts the space for directional evolutionary stewardship from the top, and it makes it difficult, if not impossible, for dominant players to repel unfavorable traits or variations that they don't like. At this stage, we can say that the coevolutionary drivers of policy diffusion in the global environment are no longer positioned from the top of the system, and that in a densely connected world, the drivers of institutional change and selection will be diffuse, and the pull can be from any point in the system. In this environment, nobody can tell which innovations will be directional and which are likely to be merely random. So a deeply problematic part of Kissinger's approach is to posit the need for a homogeneous group he calls them statespeople stationed at the top of the system to ensure order. When we read about diversity and decision-making, there's a lot of literature on this. The one thing that the people who write on this field agree is that when you are thinking about a world that has lots of complexity, the best way to arrive at a solution is to engage expertise from a wide range of subdisciplines, to tap knowledge that's widely distributed across social spectrums, and to represent the skills and individuals from many different backgrounds. Whereas Kissinger actually makes the remarkable statement that 10 great men are enough in any generation to change the course of global history. And of course, the list of the 10 great men that he gives includes Harry Truman and Jerry Ford, who are, as we all know, these were people who played a historical role entirely by happenstance. So let me go to a conclusion. And the conclusion is very, very, and what we can talk about is very broad, because the book ends with a discussion of world order and the human condition. And at this point, I'm going to go back to some of the science that's involved in how he thought this through. Because even though, as I mentioned, he's a renegade from science, he uses the limits of thermodynamic concepts or systems at equilibrium to define what he calls order or stability. And so you may say, well, if we can refute him using historical comparisons that are different from his own, why do we want to talk about scientific methodologies? And the reason is because at this point, the really critical issue is not what Henry Kissinger thinks, it's the intellectual framework that he uses, and the fact that it continues to be used, and it continues to miss large parts of the dynamics of international relations, and it leads to very flawed, in my opinion, views on how to conduct those relations. So in his world, slow means fixed, and fast degrees of freedom mean equilibrium. And in the view that I want to present to you, we have dynamic processes that can be fast, that can be slow, but they are endless. And in this environment, the description of global order, which presumes homogeneity and equilibrium, doesn't account for what I described as the internal structure or dynamics of systems that have, in fact, their own internal structures. So in nature, the laws of competition, and this is something that I'm currently writing a paper about with someone who's in the audience here, David Massad, the laws of competition seem to be subordinate to the laws of mutuality. And the reason biologists tend to think this is that ecosystems would all disintegrate if the localized conflicts within those were to determine the overall rules of the system. So mutualisms form, how mutualisms, and what I mean by mutualism, I'm using a biological term to talk about cooperation, how they form and how they propagate is actually a very important process to understand if you want to understand the future of global order. And of course, the answer that biologists would give is they result from adaptation and coevolution. And as heterogeneous agents cope with mutations or with new combinations of their own historic DNA, because that's also part of the process, is that combinations of, or building blocks that are unforeseen today are going to be the basis of the increased fitness of these countries that he describes. And so you have recombinations that will result in a way that the rules of parents do not directly transfer to the behavior of their children. So you have crossover effects, you have the recombination of existing systems, all leading to the discovery potentially of new rules and what I would call towards a new syntax for international conduct. And this new syntax may not necessarily be that of the European experience or that of the European educated global elites. Complex systems adapt to conditions in their environments, even if that means changing their internal structure. And so that is really the key insight. I will just read to you a quote from someone who started who's a pioneer in complex systems thinking, Herbert Simon, who wrote, "Human beings viewed as behaving systems are quite simple. The apparent complexity of our behavior over time is largely a reflection of the complexity of the environment in which we find ourselves." And it's exactly the environment in which we find ourselves that has changed, and because it has changed, we have to come up with new systems of analysis and new systems of behavior. Complexity science is not deterministic, but it can help us provide tools to map iterative processes and interactions that would allow us to trace both the gradual formation and the sudden demise of humanly devised structures. And so we exit the world of equilibrium and we go into the world of constant change, and we become better and better able at understanding the underlying processes at work. So that's the overall idea, and I'm open for discussion, questions, skepticism, comments, whatever.
Okay, so I've got some questions, but I'm going to hold off because I'm sure there's a bunch of people that would love to jump in here. We've got microphones, so please raise your hand. Just introduce yourself and kind of where you're from. Make sure you get a mic because we're actually doing a video recording of this for posterity here. Questions? Yep.
Do you want me to call? So this gentleman in the back. Sorry. Okay. You, yes.
I wonder if you could list the middle level institutions that give stability to your dynamic system that you've explained.
Well, very happy to have that question because a lot of the book actually deals with institutions and the misunderstood role of institutions. So I'll just say the following. Our prevailing notions of institutional adaptation I find to be very deficient because although we believe that institutions are the source of stability in our society, and the quality that enables that is of course that an institution persists beyond the life of its designer. What we tend to do is focus institutional analysis on the presumed correlations between specific institutions and large-scale behaviors and outcomes such as GDP growth. So a lot of the work on institutions actually tries to correlate GDP outcomes with particular institutional structures. And this usually involves enormous amount of causal reductionism, and in my opinion, often results in very unsatisfactory outcomes. And institutions frequently are looked upon by social scientists as a code script for which things that are sensible in economic behavior reflect in terms of the incentives that result from having the right kinds of institutions. But the problem with this is that trying to reduce complex systems to properties of composite elements generally leads to misconceptions. In fact, one thing we learn about complex systems is that we can't separate a system into its parts without affecting how the parts will operate. So to understand large-scale social aggregates, it's not sufficient simply to understand intrinsic fitness of system components or of institutions. So basically, it's the interrelationship of institutions that matter, and what the institutions are in the middle that matter are very local. They're institutions. They're also social behaviors. They're basically cognitive frameworks that we need to really understand, and the way of understanding cognitive frameworks in traditional social science is very different from how complexity theorists would approach.
Those institutions by
Yeah.
name.
Well, that's what I'm saying. There's no specific list. It's the cognitive frameworks of the players or the actors in those institutions that will determine the effects of those institutions. So I don't want to separate.
Give me a name.
Maybe I'm not understanding the question. What do you mean by a name?
Are there educational institutions, or what institutions are you talking about?
Okay. Lots of institutions exist that have historic legacies, and they have intentionality built into the design. These intentionalities that are built into the design of those institutions may not actually guide how those institutions evolve over time. So institutions can be put to use that vary very much from what their creators intended. So the institutions that may be there today are not necessarily going to behave in the way, according to the code script, that let's say a Kissinger type approach would attribute to them. They're going to be in constant change. They're going to be part of, and so I prefer to view institutions in terms of their relationship with other institutions. So that's why I'm not sure I can name 2 or 3 institutions. I mean, I can name thousands of institutions. We could talk about budgetary institutions in Egypt. Sally, who's sitting here, works on these institutions. These institutions are very important constraints on the behavior of the Egyptian polity. They follow certain rules, and they're consistent with some of the with the way Egypt has evolved, but they're changing very rapidly because of Egypt's changing role in the world, but not only with regard to the United States, but its role in the Middle East. So I just don't have 2 or 3 institutions that I would choose. I could choose thousands. My main point is that you can take any institution, doesn't matter what institution it is, and apply the kind of framework that I'm suggesting, and you will get a very interesting set of inferences that you could draw. And so I'm sure you're not satisfied, but let's move on to another question. Yes, you.
Many centuries ago, we had a few families, as you said, interrelated, who formed big complexes, empires, Austrian, Hungarian, German, French, and so forth. And the people that under them more or less followed their leadership for one reason or another. In the 18th and 19th century, we had large revolutions that got rid of all these leaders. And suddenly people formed groups according to their different objectives. And as objectives changed, the different groups formed other different groups. And there was a very large variety of groups that formed, and that's still the system that we have today. As we saw in the paper today, there's a new group that formed just to get rid of ISIS in Afghanistan. So groups form these days, in my opinion, to follow common objectives. And as these objectives have a very large variety, it's almost impossible to put that Humpty Dumpty back together again. You will have more and more groups that form different objectives who are not in common. And the question is where the dynamics gonna come from to combine people with different objectives.
Yes, I agree. That's the issue that both my book and Kissinger's book addresses. That's the common concern that we share. So we don't have answers, but what I'm proposing is that how we think about the problems and the analytical perspectives we bring to bear on the problem will determine to a great extent how we will what policies we'll design, what responses we're likely to have, how we'll interact with all these different groups. It will be a lot more complex than equilibrium among groups, balancing of power among groups, the way Kissinger sees global order emerging. So in fact, I would say that there will be emergent there will be emergence from these groups interacting. They will develop rules of interaction, and these rules of interaction will change the larger system, and so we will have and we don't know where it will end and what kind of overall structure or how sustainable that might be. So I completely agree. That was what I originally wanted to say. That was the motivating question, that we have this changed global environment, which is very different from the 18th century, which is the global environment that operated successfully according to Westphalian principles. And so the point I wanted to make was, I agree with you that we can't go back to the Westphalian principles because the foundation for those principles, the sociological foundation for those principles, are no longer here. So I think it is a flawed effort to try to go back to those in the context of the environment that you described. Yes, please. They're coming with a microphone.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kent Hughes here at the Wilson Center. And you alluded to a new group of countries emerging facing an old set of rules, kind of Bretton Woods meets the BRICS, so to speak. But the BRICS want to participate in this global economy, the 21st century version of a mixed system, say today's capitalism. And it is in some sense the answer to Trotsky's dream of a continuous revolution. So how do the BRICS resist that and participate at the same time?
Well, this will be, once again, one of the unfolding issues. The BRICS, Kissinger points out when the BRICS meet, they could agree on one thing, which is containing U.S. hegemony. But other than that, they can't agree on anything else. So it's a discovery process for them every time they get together to find some commonalities. And so far they have found very few. But the BRICS and maybe that's what this other gentleman was alluding to, they're trying to institutionalize, but they have to have a common vision of what they want to accomplish, and they haven't been able to do so. So there's no actual institutional structure that's emerging from their interactions that at this point might have a directional or deterministic influence on global affairs. And the BRICS may actually decide in the end that the institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, the universal institutions that currently exist, might actually be as good as any that they're likely to come up with. So they might switch their effort into influencing the structure and behavior of those institutions. But Kissinger, by the way, believes that the only really significant institutions in terms of global affairs are national ones. He very strongly, he's a very strong skeptic with regard to international institutions, and that's why I think it's not ironic to have this discussion here in the Wilson building. Yes, Claudia.
I'm Claudia Ferris, George Mason University. I'm reaching for this question, so give me some slack there. There was a time when institutions had a dynamic that involved seeking their own survival. So they would do things that were designed to make them continue as institutions regardless of why they were formed. In that sense, they were a kind of embedded history, right? So on the other hand, you had environment, which was more sort of open and non-directed, if you will. It was just environment. Now you've got, under complexity, you've got an interplay between the two, which makes me ask, how are they different? I'm not sure that's the right articulation of the question, but the issue is institutions, as was defined by this gentleman, are no longer have that kind of long view and sense of stability, and so as we do our complexity analyses, we tend to incorporate the environment, which is one of the things that makes complexity analysis so different from economics. We incorporate the environment as one of the players, right?
Yeah.
So
The environment's an agent.
yeah. So where does the stability and the ongoingness of us, our culture, our countries, our whatever, come from? Is that important?
No.
Okay, I'll stop. Because
Yeah,
there's
well, I understand exactly what you're saying and where you're coming from. Institutions involve constant rebalancing. I think this is the most realistic assumption concerning institutions, but all of us are kind of reaching out to ask, where is the stability going to come from? And somehow we all seem to believe that there's an institutional answer to all of this. And what I'm suggesting is that complex ecosystems have their own internally generated dynamics and rules, and they're not in equilibrium systems. And it's so hard for us to contemplate that we live in a non-equilibrium universe, and to think about human relationships and human agency in terms of interactions that are continuously changing rather than interactions that we can institutionally impose a structure on. And so this is what this is why this is the complexity challenge, is to think about the fact, and this is the fundamental insight, one of the fundamental insights of complexity is that, complexity thinking is that you could have institutions, some people use the word phrase on the edge of chaos, that are constantly changing at a very, very rapid rate, but it's not chaotic. These complex systems are fundamentally non-random systems. They have structure, and the structure takes the form of iterative patterns, and we can see these structures emerge. And as you know, when we do agent-based models and we build a system of actors with simple rules, and they create environments, and the environments are the product of their interactions, and so the world that they live in is actually the world that they create. But of course, the interactions themselves form structures, and they become agents, and they now are another input into the dynamics of the system. So when we learn to think about order in that way, we are going to start to understand the real dilemmas of international relations that we'll be facing in the future. And if we constantly go back to, let's get the institutional structure right, let's fix it, and we're never going to fix it that way, and there's not going to be a deterministic institutional structure that can create from which we can derive a direction for the complexity of interactions that are taking place at all these levels, and so that's why we require a shift into a new system of thinking, and scientists have already done this. The question is, how do we get people in international relations to think about something that is more than an institute, more than that has a lifespan of almost, unlimited lifespan. The system itself is going to continue, and if you actually break down Kissinger's record, one of the, you look at each of the interventions that he designed or institutions that he facilitated during his time in power, you would see that he anticipates only a very small amount of the actual feedback that these institutions generate, and quite often they generate results over time that were deleterious to the goals that he would have sought. And this is why I said earlier that the time framework, the events are either faster than his resolution period of thinking or slower. And this is because of what, as people work, there are scale effects. These are systems that have different time durations and different starting points of the components that nevertheless are interdependent, but they're acting at different time scales. And yes, Jack, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you for this, Hilton. One of the things we learn about complex systems is that systems that seem to be stable or moving in one direction for a long time can very suddenly alter their direction or suddenly become unstable, and it's because of the dynamics that underlie. And in the area of international relations, the possibilities you raise are that the movement that we saw, the kind of Fukuyama end of history, that the entire global system is moving toward a liberal order, was a superficial and temporally limited view, that in reality the pieces are shifting underneath. And so now, instead of that spread of liberalization, we see the emergence of authoritarian illiberal leaders in Turkey, in Russia, in China, possibly in India. Modi is, I think, somewhat an unknown characteristic there. So is it possible that we could see a sudden shift in the world system in which this liberal order, instead of being a dominant tendency, becomes a tendency on the defensive, that we just see a sudden shift with a different mode of national institutions becoming stronger than we would have expected?
Yes, I think that's a very realistic expectation, that liberalism or the liberal institutional world order that we aspire to create and that represents the Wilsonian vision is a parochial vision that corresponds to the historical experiences or strong rules learned and won in a particular context, in a particularly a European state system context, with Russia and the U.S. being part of it, that larger system, but as outliers, but having representing very strong basins of attraction within that system. So yes, we could definitely see a new basin of attraction emerging that has a new gravitational pull that might be very different from the pull that would have led to a world liberal order, the way Wilson was hoping to achieve. So I agree with all of that. I mean, all of the things that we are talking about are non-deterministic. We don't have a good system that can determine the probabilities by which we could construct a deterministic map of what tendencies we should pay most attention to, and what tendencies we should pay least attention to. So one of the insights that we get from applying complexity in public policy is that we need to constantly check where we are in a process, and we shouldn't have these large projects. We should have projects that are constantly being resorted out and examined as the effects factor in. And that's also very contrary to the way Washington works. So, if you look at a field like education, somebody mentioned education. I just remember that Paul Krugman 2 days ago wrote an article to remind economists that education as a single input, you can put a lot of money into education and it never produces growth, because education is part of a larger social dynamic, and you have to do a lot of other things. So projects need to be defined not in terms of, we're going to inject 10 billion into education, but they have to be defined in terms of the system, the impact, the feedbacks that input would have, and the feedbacks that will come back to it. And we could do this. The skills to do this exist, but we tend not to do it. And one of the questions that David had asked me is, how does our public policy environment deal with complexity, and who does it very well? Well, we deal with it very badly. Who deals with it best? Well, people who deal with immunology and the outbreak of disease. They use complexity all the time. Countries that have dealt well with terrorism, such as the Israelis, have used complexity analysis, and that is their fundamental framework. There are people who deal with traffic that have actually done some really good work in understanding traffic flows. There are parts of the public policy environment, the three that I mentioned in particular, that have used complexity effectively. But they are isolated. We could learn from them, but we tend, and the reasons why it happens to be in immunology is because of the urgency of what an outbreak would be, and also because of the amount of data that we have in that sector. So, for example, when we look at projects that we could do where there's adequate data to actually see complex relationships unfold, they tend to be in the health sector. Yes?
All right, thank you. You have a bit of advantage on me because I've read Henry Kissinger's book, but not yours. But I will say it strikes me is that your presentation of Kissinger's view, it seems to me a pretty broad oversimplification of his views. And I'll look forward to, if I'm one of the lucky winners, to reading your book and seeing if I'm wrong on that.
Well, my book doesn't deal with Kissinger's views. Kissinger's book actually published after my book was published. I didn't read his book until last weekend.
Right. I understand that, but I still stand by the earlier statement. However, in relationship to your presentation here, there are a lot of examples of countries that have made institutional choices. And the ones that everybody's familiar with are South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, that essentially have chosen those institutions that Kissinger essentially celebrates. And others, Sri Lanka, India, haven't. China adopted them late and only began to make huge progress in getting rid of poverty, increasing lifespan, expanding scope for individual freedom after those institutions were adopted. So given that comparative examples already exist, I'm interested in your response to that.
Well, you're definitely asking the right person. I've written several books on East Asia. The East Asian Miracle, a book called Small Countries, Big Lessons. They describe the process of institutional development there as in terms of creating, making the promise credible through institutional development, and doing so through inclusive social systems, inclusive sharing of the benefits of potential growth. Anyway, so I've written books on this. It would be very hard for me to, encapsulate them in a sentence, but I can assure you that my answers to the success of the East Asian countries is very consistent with the analysis that I just presented to you, and very much divergent from Kissinger's views. And by the way, my views are much more widely accepted in the field of East Asia, because the books that I wrote happen to be the most widely published books in that field. Yes, this gentleman here.
Stuart Umpleby, George Washington University. Well, I want to thank you for a very stimulating conversation. I'm very glad that the Wilson Center is conducting this series of meetings. When I think about complexity, I often think in terms of information. And you focused pretty exclusively, it seems to me, on institutions. So let me give 3 examples of information. Like during World War II, propaganda was mostly a matter of mobilization. So the Allies are good, the Axis is bad, let's go fight the Axis. Putin in Ukraine seems to be using a strategy that's sort of similar to the climate change debate, and that is to throw out so many explanations which are patently outrageous that all explanations are discounted. And that works to the disadvantage of people who are trying to be truthful. So if you just don't pay attention to the explanations, then it's hard to get your message through. A second example is cyber war. Like, we used to defeat other countries by blowing things up. Now we try to pinpoint what we blow up and then only blow up as much as possible. But we also, as little as possible. But we also make ourselves vulnerable by putting all of our data on the internet. So if ISIS has some very clever hackers, they can be as effective at messing up the US as Russia or China. The third example would be the global university system. If you're looking for stability, higher education is amazingly inertial. But the values are shared around the world. So to the extent that you can bring people into the global university system, you have a great source of stability.
Yeah, well, somebody once said that it's easier to change the curriculum of a university it's compared to moving tombstones in a cemetery. It's just a very difficult thing to do. The agenda of education is actually the agenda as an educator I'm most interested in, and essentially what it would entail if we were to adopt the approach that I'm suggesting is that we would create a completely new structure for knowledge in which these human sciences would be covered in one part of the university and would require that someone who wanted to read Shakespeare should also understand evolutionary biology and ecology, that we're talking about human living systems. And so all living systems should be in one part of the university, and then we would have the mechanical systems and in another part, and you would have physics and you would have engineering there, and then you might have complexity theory as an integrative intermediary zone. But it is problematic that people who read Shakespeare don't know anything about ecology. And in fact, they might find that a lot of what makes Shakespeare's ideas great is that his ideas are very consistent with ecological and evolutionary biological views. So I would want to transform education. That would be actually my number one priority. And I go to meetings quite often with other scholars who want to do the same thing. They're usually philosophers, and they also see the limits of humanitarian education or humanistic education that doesn't include human sciences. It doesn't include how a human being and a cell or human neurology works. And this is the problem with Kissinger. He comes out of a pre-scientific, non-scientific world that comes out with simplicities of thinking that are inconsistent with fundamental scientific principles, and this is the real issue here. This is the issue that the only thing I would really like you to take away from this talk is the fact that we have an intellectual framework that's being used by a very prominent thinker, which is no longer in touch with fundamental science. It's diverged so much from fundamental science that a scientist cannot recognize this as logic. There is no logic in it, and that's the problem. And it can only be corrected by a major transformation of education, and I'm very much into that. But when I go to these meetings, I never see university presidents there or deans. I see people who are, interested in the philosophical implications of living in a world where you've separated humanistic living systems and the study of those from the study of the human condition. And that needs to be brought together. So that's what I'm strongly advocate of that. I just want to go around the room, Claudia, and get some other comments. Yes?
My name is Toyomi, fellow in Woodrow Wilson Center.
Oh, you're waiting for the microphone, okay.
Toyomi, a fellow in Woodrow Wilson Center. I understand your analysis is based on very deductive methodology, and I wonder if your argument is open to the possibility of rebuttal. And I want to question to you, is it possible for human beings to eventually to change the structure of patterns of interactions? Is it possible for human beings to change the structure of patterns of interactions? And in order to explain my argument, my question briefly, for example, in East Asia, how do you explain the economic miracle of the Korea or Taiwan? How do you explain?
Okay,
Security Treaty and market or IMF or many institutions, and maybe hub and spoke, informal institutions. How do you explain this? Is your institutions include such informal institutions?
Yeah,
Or such a
let me
very
answer.
specially related to nations as South Korea or Japan? The nation itself might be institutions for your argument.
Okay, this is a very brilliant question, and let me answer the first part. The first part is that the goal of complexity science in terms of public policy is not just to change the laws, but to change the underlying behavior of people so that they become more aware of the ecological or ecosystem consequences or implications of their behavior. So this is a process of providing people with information that they can see how the patterns of their behavior both reflect the environment that they live in and also contribute to the evolution of that environment. In other words, it's to pinpoint the interaction of a human being and the environment and to identify directional prospects for coordinating behavior with outcomes that we might think are more conducive to a shared ecosystem that would be more resilient. So that's the agenda here. And that agenda applies to public policy in every domain, including international relations. But the second question you answered is how I deal with East Asia. So I really would have to tell you to read the book, because half of the book is about China and how China is different from the West and how the internal dynamics of Chinese society have followed a pattern that has a lot to do with the particular network structures that were created a long time ago and that are in fact have very robust qualities, but have some qualities some vulnerabilities that distributed or scale-free systems that don't necessarily have. There's a very interesting set of arguments in sociology that would debate in the 1970s when I was a graduate student. There was a sociologist named Ron Burt. I don't know how many of you know him. He's a very formidable thinker, and he wrote about structural holes, and he wrote about the comparative advantages of centralized systems and decentralized systems. And interestingly, in those days, with the analytical tools that we had, he drew that the centralized systems, including China, would be more capable of making better decisions more effectively. But he never considered resilience. He never considered the vulnerability or the redundancies of some systems that actually gave them resilience. So just the other day, Claudia had this incredible experience where she found out that her brain had redundancies that allowed it to do to survive shocks that could have destroyed her or unbalanced her. And you see, the problem is the Chinese system doesn't have that. And Ron Burt didn't understand that in the 1970s. Now today, we understand that resilience, at least I believe, from what I deduce from science, that resilience is a fundamental property of systems that we need to think about when we're designing public policies and we're designing systems. And as far as deductive, yes, you could say that I have deduced the framework of ideas that I presented to you, but on the other hand, ironically, I'm telling you that you need to be inductive, and that to be a good complex systems thinker, you're basically going to be inductive and get away from Newtonian thermodynamic deductive theories into inductive ones, which tell you that order arises from within a system. So I deductively became inductive, but I've reversed the order. Yes, are we?
Yeah, we're kind of drawing to a close, but we want to make sure we give away books.
Yes.
And you've got some time to sign books and also talk to people some more. So
Yes.
I think, Aaron, you've got the list, right?
Yes. So if I say your name, could you just sort of raise your hand, and then we'll meet you out there, and you can claim your prize. Amanda Fagerblom. Thank you. Kirby Mason Bryan. David Sedney.
Ah, so he has to read the book. There's your punishment.
Congratulations.
We didn't rig that.
Yeah.
That just happened. Right?
Kent Hughes. Julia Adams. Julia Feinsilver. Matthew Jelisic. Michael Yang. John Honig. Joyce Koo. Keir Pitts. Mata Petrovic. Thank you.
All right. Hilton, thank you very much. This discussion will continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. By the way, if you didn't win the book and you still want one, there are a few books for sale at all.